good thing to do, but
nice.
yeah, but we'll get to it. We'll get to it. Okay, we're in the middle of discussing we are in the middle of discussing the specific question whether or not the prohibition to prevent an animal from being in pain. I wouldn't say prohibition. I would say the better word is the concept of preventing an animal from suffering. Is that a biblical concept or is that a rabbinical concept? Okay. The reason why we're discussing this, obviously, is because we're discussing the commandments of prika and te'ina. Prika, obviously, is you have an animal that's stumbling, right? As you mentioned, maybe not because it was overloaded, right? Because if it's overloaded, it could be you don't have any obligation. We'll get to that in a moment. You have an obligation to unload an animal that stumbled upon its load. That seems to imply that there is such a commandment. And the Gemara sort of questions whether or not it's a specific general application of the same rule or not. And one of the questions, for example, was, according to Rabbi Dovid, if somebody overloads his animal, you don't need to help him. Well, if Tzar B'Lachaim is a standalone theme in this mitzvah, who cares about what the owner did? There should still be a standalone concept to prevent suffering to the stumbling animal. Clearly, the Gemara agrees that Rabbi Dovid holds Tzar B'Lachaim is lav da'oraisa. According to Rabbi Dovid, it is not a biblical concept. And that is why if somebody violates, I guess he overloads the animal intentionally. Mm-hmm. So then you don't have to help him or his animal. You can let his animal suffer. I have 4 lines in the bottom of the page. 5 lines, I'm sorry. Toshma. You have from 32b. Toshma. Okay, this is an interesting law, by the way. Oyev lifrik v'sayin litin. Okay, so generally speaking, you have 2 commandments. Prika is to unload the animal. Te'ina is to load an animal. So again, if a guy's animal sort of the Mishnah says the load was removed from the animal, the guy needs help putting the load back on, you're obligated to help him. Now, generally speaking, which one do you think is more important, prika or te'ina?
If he's overloading the animal,
loading or unloading?
Which is more important?
Which you think is more important?
So say unloading.
Unloading, because like we pointed out yesterday, there's 2 problems with unloading. First of all, is that the animal's suffering. And second of all, is because if you can't get it off, there's a potential financial loss there. Either the animal or the stuffing might get ruined. Mm-hmm. Whereas te'ina is sort of a convenience to the future. Like we said in the past, it could be te'ina you're even allowed to charge for. Te'ina is loading. So clearly unloading is more important. This is
What if you're made to overload the animal by helping the owner load it up? Is that?
Well, you wouldn't do that.
Yeah, well, you shouldn't do that. Yeah. But the owner might,
so you don't have to participate. Okay. In general, according to the Tanna Kamma, te'ina is always with payment. You're always hired for it. Okay. Now, so you have Toshma. Okay. So now, like we said before, like the way Jules correctly answered, prika comes before te'ina, unloading before loading. You have 2 people. One needs help unloading. One needs help loading. You help the guy unloading. Except in this scenario, you have oyev lifrik, a guy who you love, your friend. He needs help unloading. The Sinai, the guy you don't like, needs help litin. He needs help to load the animal. Mitzvah b'Sinai. It's a mitzvah to go help the one who you don't like. Why? They loch if it's yitzrei. This is the I'm sure Charles will give us a psychological term here. This is a way to sort of fight your evil inclination. In other words, a person has a person's convenience and drive and matter of habit would have him not help his enemy. So therefore, the Torah says, to the contrary, it'd be good for your midas to go do it anyway. So that's why you should do it first.
Sublimation.
I'm sorry, what's it called?
Sublimation, I believe.
Sublimation. Thank you. Sublimate his desires actively. Okay, but if you're going to say that the main concern of this mitzvah is tzar b'lachayim, then who cares about who you like and who you hate? It's irrelevant who your friend and who your enemy is. The main thing is you have an animal in distress. Go help the animal in distress first. It's clearly this isn't the case that tzar b'lachayim is not the da'oraisa. So the Gemara says no. It could be tzar b'lachayim is da'oraisa. However, I feel it is more important for a person to sublimate his strong desire than for him to save an animal from distress. And therefore, even though it is true that the theme is tzar v'lechaim, not preventing undue stress from an animal, but what's more important is for a person to control his inclinations, his desires, and therefore that takes priority. Toshma, okay. So let's just give a little context here. The next brisa is a very vague statement. It's not clear what the statement refers to. It refers to one thing in the beginning of the Gemara, and then at the conclusion of the Gemara, it refers to something else, and that sort of resolves the question. Okay, I'll just jump the gun here. The conclusion is that this brisa is actually interpreting the line of Mishnah we just read. So we just read about a lover, a sayane, a friend, and an oyev and a sayane, a friend and an enemy. The conclusion of the Gemara will be that the next Gemara is actually explaining what the enemy is. However, for now, before we get to the conclusion, the Gemara is saying that Toshma, it has to be a Jewish enemy and not a non-Jewish enemy. And the Gemara presumes that this is referring to the verse in the Torah. The verse in the Torah explains the commandment of unloading in the context of an enemy. Right? The donkey of your enemy. So the Gemara thinks that this is referring to the verse. And basically, if you see a non-Jewish donkey overloaded, you don't have any obligation to help him. Now, why is that? If you say that preventing undue stress on the animal is biblical, who cares who owns the animal suffering? You should still have to help. So Gemara says, we're not referring here to the verse. We're referring here to the previous Mishnah, the previous brisa that we brought as proof. Meaning the brisa said that an enemy, you load an enemy's animal before unloading a friend's animal, but that's only enemy defined as a Jewish enemy. That's why we would say to sublimate your desire is more important than unloading a Jewish animal. And so, in other words, loading your Jewish enemy's animal takes priority over unloading your Jewish friend's animal. However, unloading your non-Jewish unloading your non-Jewish enemy's animal does not take priority over unloading your Jewish friend's animal.
Okay.
You got it?
Yeah, go on.
Okay. Toshma, next attempt, top of 33a. Okay. The Mishnah says we talk about an animal that was roivetz. Roivetz means it sort of sat down because of the loads. So the Gemara explains roivetz excludes v'loy rafson. If you have an animal that's known for always collapsing, he always sits down in the middle of the roads, you don't have to help him. Roivetz, it was sat down, v'loy oimet tachas masay. And because it's not able to hold the load, v'loy mifurik tachas masay. And this commandment refers to unloading the animal, so that meaning that the animal stumbles with the load on it, not that the load is off and the guy needs help reloading it. And also masay, the load, it has to be a load that the guy can hold. If you say that tzar b'lechaim, preventing the pain to the animal, is biblical, mali roivetz, mali ravson, who cares if the animal is an animal that normally sits in the middle of the street? And moreover, who cares if the animal didn't actually stumble, but it's still standing, but it can't carry the loads? You still should have an obligation to unload it. So the Gemara says, "Hamani basically this price is clearly basically anyway." Why? We'll explain in a moment. He is of the opinion that the theme of the commandment of unloading an animal is not biblical; it's rabbinical. And it's clear. The truth of the matter is, it's clear this price is basically why is this? It defines the load as a load the animal's able to bear. Who's that opinion? Who holds that you only have to help him unload the animal if the animal was able to hold the load in the first place? Rabbi Saglili, it's the opinion of Rabbi Saglili. Shema Mina, clearly Rabbi Saglili is of the opinion that says Rabbi Yosef is the author of this brisa, and that makes sense because Rabbi Yosef is the one to say Tzar B'Chaim is rabbinical. So the Gemara questions, Can you explain this brisa as Rabbi Yosef, under the authorship of Rabbi Yosef Lili, Vaktani Sefer? You look at the end of the brisa. Tachas Masai v'loy meforak. The brisa says that you have an obligation to load the animal, but not to unload the animal. I'm sorry. You have an obligation to unload the animal, but the same obligation does not apply to loading the animal. Now, let's make this clear. The rabbis have the same terminology in the Mishnah. The Mishnah we just saw, there's a debate. I'm just going to explain to you the interpretation of the Mishnah is that unloading the animal is a free service. If you're a member of the Jewish club, then we all participate, we all have agreement, we give interest-free loans, we return lost objects, now we have a new one, right? Member of the club, you get free services for unloading the animal. If Tzar B'Chaim is lav deraisa. If Tzar B'Chaim is deraisa, then everybody gets the service. Anytime an animal is suffering, and you can prevent it, you help out. Okay, so you have a commandment to unload the animal. However, when it comes to loading the animal, you can charge. Now, this brisa specifically mentions that you only have to help unloading an animal, not loading an animal. What does that mean? It probably means the same thing in the Mishnah, meaning that you unload an animal for free, and to load an animal, you can charge. 1 second. One second. Okay, 1 second. If it means that so what does it mean you don't unload? I'm sorry, you don't load. Meaning that you don't have an obligation to load an animal. The first specific says you do have an obligation to load an animal. It must mean that loading an animal means for free, but you can charge for it. It's the rabbis that hold that loading an animal can come at a cost. Okay, so therefore clearly this brisa is the opinion of the rabbis. So says, meaning there's a debate between the rabbis and Rabbi Shimon whether or not you can charge for loading an animal. Rabbi Yosef Lili also has another opinion, which is an independent question, which is that can you charge? Are you obligated to unload an overburdened animal? An animal that the owner deliberately overburdens. Separate question. So the Gemara says, you're right, Rabbi Yossi has one opinion with regard to an overburdened animal, and he actually agrees to the rabbis when it comes to the question of loading an animal. Rabbi Yossi actually agrees that you can load at cost, with a charge. You can charge for it. Okay, Tana Rabbanan.
Right page, please.
We are about 5 lines before the Mishnah on 33a.
33, really?
33a. Tana Rabbanan, Kisira, if you'll see the animal, afilu merochik, even from a distance. Talmud Leimar Kisifka. You sort of bump into it. Okay, so Kisira refers to the verse referring to unloading the animal. Kisifka, when you sifka is when you encounter, that refers to returning a lost animal. Again, the commandments here are very simple. Unloading a burdened animal and returning a lost object are very similar ideas. Okay, so the Gemara says you have to see it and you have to encounter it. So what exactly? What does it mean that you have to see and encounter? How do you fulfill both verses? What does it mean to see that which you encounter? 1 7.5 of a mil. 1 over 7.5 of a mil. A mil again is approximately 3,500 feet. So divide that by 7.5.
It's okay.
What?
I mean, we don't have to do the math.
Yeah, somewhere around 400 feet, 350 feet, somewhere around that. Okay, so 400. V'zehu ris. That's 400 feet. V'zehu ris. That's called a ris. Tana we learned. Umidade imay ad parsa. Okay, so this is very important. It's like you see somebody on the side of the road, right? You give him a boost. So you drive with him for a few minutes to make sure his car is running well, right? It's the same thing is true. You load an animal, you want to make sure that the load it worked out. It doesn't have to be reloaded. So medad imay parsa, you walk with him an additional parsa. It's another, another few thousand feet. The escort you can charge for. You can charge for loading the animal. But if the guy asks to be escorted in case, the animal falls down in the next 200 feet,
Right.
that you're able to charge for.
So unloading is biblical. Loading is
Both
forbidden.
unloading and loading are biblical.
Or both. are
The
biblical.
question is if the theme of that is tsar v'lechaim or not. Preventing undue pain to an animal.
So how does loading? So that's why
Loading is sort of the normal use of an animal.
okay.
So it's permitted to load. You're obviously allowed to load an animal and use an animal. Right. It would have the theme of unloading. It potentially might be tsar v'lechaim. Might be preventing undue stress on undue pain in the animal. And loading obviously is a commandment. You have to help somebody load, but you're able to charge for, according to the rabbi's opinion. According to Rabbi Shimon, you can't charge.
All right. Thank you.
Okay. Very interesting Mishnah. Avedose ve'avedes aviv. A person finds his own. A person is looking for a lost object together with his father's lost object. Which one takes priority? Avedose kedemes lav.
Okay, it's dad.
Avedose kedemes. His personal lost object takes precedence. Okay. Avedose ve'avedes rabbi. His lost object or his rabbi's lost object. Shaloi kaidem. His lost object comes first. What happens now if you have a clash of values? Avedas aviv avedas rabbi, his father and his teacher. We'll soon see this is a Torah teacher, and we'll have to give a strict definition in a few minutes. Shal rabbi kedemus, his master comes first. The master here is a Torah master, and again we'll define it very shortly. Sha'aviv hivil al mazeh, his father brought him to this world physically. Rabbi shalom dechachma mivil chayil mabah, but his master that taught him Torah wisdom brings him to the next world. But if his father is himself a rabbi, shalav kademetz, his father comes first. If his father and his master were carrying a burden, meaning that their animals are stumbling, first he helps his master, then he helps his father. Or even if it wasn't their animals, it was themselves. Each were carrying a burden. He unloads his master first, and then his father. If his father and his teacher were in they were taken captive, first he redeems his Rebbe, his teacher, and afterwards he redeems his father. But if his father is a scholar, first he redeems his father, and then he redeems his Torah teacher. How do we know that your lost object comes before your father and before your teacher? So Amar Yehudah Rav, we said this verse before. I won't go through it as much as I did last time. Amar Kra, the verse says, "Efes kol b'cha evin." So again, the context of this verse is not a commandment; it's just a statement that there will not be any poor amongst you. The Talmud, however, takes this as sort of a practical advice: don't do something that will bring you to poverty. And the first thing that will bring you to poverty is by focusing on everybody else to the exclusion of yourself. So therefore, a person is obligated with his own finances first. Your own finances come before everybody else. However, there's a big caveat here. Yehudah says in the name of Rav, whoever takes this pasuk too seriously, eventually he'll become poor anyway. Okay? In other words, obviously, the way Rashi puts it is that you need a hefsid mechiach. Person should only focus on himself when there's a certain loss if he doesn't focus on himself. But if the loss is not certain, then he should focus on his father first. Focus on other people first. Meaning, let's say he knows he'll be able to get back both lost objects. Don't go back. Don't get back yours first. Go back your father. Go get your teacher. Go get somebody else's lost object first, and then afterwards you can go back and get yourself. If you're only able to get back one, that's called a hefsid mechiach. It's a certain loss. If you don't try to get back your own, you will not be able to get it. Then you prioritize yourself.
It's almost like Kollel's rule about you take care of yourself first and the community second. However he said that.
Yeah. Okay. His father and his teacher were carrying a burden. Tanur Rabbanan, the rabbis taught. Rabbi Shamru, the teacher that we taught that we discussed. Rabbi Shalom de Chachma, Rabbi Shalom de Mikra. We're talking about a teacher of wisdom, and it's not sufficient if he just taught you Mikra. Mikra is the verses, Mishnah or Mishnayos. Divrei Meir, that's the opinion of Rabbi Yehudah. Yehudah says it's got to be more than that. It's not just wisdom of the Talmud. It's called Sharoiv Chachmas Himenu. It has to be that the majority of his wisdom came from that teacher. So it can't just be somebody who helped out teaching. It has to be a teacher who has the majority, who's provided with the majority of your wisdom. Rabbi Yossi Aimer, by the way, not everyone necessarily has that. Rabbi Yossi Aimer, I feel like heir ein of elo Mishnah achas zehu rabbi. How do you define it? Even somebody who explains to you a single Mishnah, that's called your teacher, your Rebbe. Amar Rava, what's an example of this? Kigoin Rav Schayra, like Rav Schayra, the Azbar and Zuam Listerin. Without getting, there's a few Mishnayos here. I'm not going to go through them at length. Basically, there was a scholar whose name was Rav Schayra. He was significantly less scholarly than Rava. However, he did explain to Rava the definition of a vessel called a zuamolisteron. Okay, the zuamolisteron basically is some sort of like slotted spoon or something that takes the fat layer off of a pot. Once the fat is congealed, it sort of takes the fat. That's what it is. He didn't know what it was. He explained to him what it was, and that would be sufficient according to Rabbi Yossi's opinion. Rabbi Yossi's opinion again is that any type of teacher constitutes your teacher. Shmuel Karamani Allah, Hahum Rabbanon, the Asbury Echad Yer Al-Amos, Shakti Ve'echad Pesach Kevan. Okay, there's a Mishnah that talks here about how to open the temple every morning. So the temple consisted of a large, talking about the temple meaning what we call the building, the ulam and the ulam of the heichal. So there was an ulam, there was an outer large building. There was an inner heichal, and the heichal surrounded by 36 chambers called ta'im. And we talk about the direction of which one of the ta'im were never allowed to. Nobody was allowed to be present in that room. And the question was how to open the doors of the various ta'im. And he explained that Mishnah to Shmuel. Okay, and so in other words, Shmuel had a student that explained to him a single Mishnah, and when he died, he ripped his clothing in pain and anguish over that student. Amar Ula says, the scholars in Bavel, so there was a lot of there was a lot of communal interaction. They sort of were all each other's teacher because they engaged communally so much with each other. So therefore, they sort of sit all around each other because they're all students of one another. The current zalza, and if one of them dies, they all tear their clothes one for another because they're all each other's teachers. So in Aveda, with regard to lost objects, however, with regard to a lost object, you give your father back first, unless the teacher is your Rabbi Muvik. Rabbi Muvik means the teacher that's taught you the majority of your studies, majority of your Torah. Okay. Rav Chizda had the following question from Rav Huna. Talmud v'tzarech le'Rabbi imai. Okay. So this was a dangerous question. He said to him, "What happens if the master needs the student? Is that called also the type of does one return the lost object of such a teacher before his father?" Now,
what's different about this case, Rabbi? Explain to me again.
So typically, a master doesn't need the student.
Yeah, doesn't need the student, you say?
Correct.
Okay.
Master will teach somebody else. Doesn't need the student.
Right.
What happens if you have a student who's a quasi-contemporary? The master needs the student to study as well.
All right.
So does he have the status of a Rabbi Muvik or not?
Okay.
Now, Rav Huna took this very personally, because he thought that Rav Chizda was implying was that he needs Rav Chizda. Rav Chizda was a student.
Yes.
So Amar Leis, Rav Huna said to him, Chizda let tzarichna lach. Chizda, I don't need you. Ad tzarichas li, you need me. Okay. Adar Ba and Shana Ikbid Adadi. For 40 years, they were very upset at each other for this. They did not go to each other. Rav Chizda fasted for 40 days because he got his teacher very upset. Yosef Rav Huna Rabban Tanaisim Shem Dechaj Rav Chisda. Rav Huna also sat 40 Tanaisim because he suspected Rav Chisda was trying to imply that he needed his student. Okay, and apparently after 40 years they made up. Itmar Rav Yitzchak Bar Yosef Amar Rav Yechanan Halachic Rav Yehudah.
Took him 40 years to interpret the.
Yeah. It's interesting. I have
Hey,
I've a distant family relative that for about 40 years, and father and son actually.
Yeah,
Okay, not quite a father and son. It was a
it's all right. Okay.
yeah.
Needs
It was a son with his stepfather. Okay, Itmar Rav Yitzchak Bar Yosef Amar Rav Yechanan. Rav Yitzchak says him. Rav Yechanan Halach Rav Yehudah. Halach follows Rav Yehudah. Rav Acha Bar Rav Yehudah's opinion. Rav Yehuda's opinion says Roiv Chachmasai, majority of his wisdom. Rav Acha Bar Rav Huna Amar Rav Sheshes Halach Rav Yosi. However, Rav Acha in the name of Rav Huna says that the halacha is like Rav Yosi. Rav Yosi is the one that says even one Mishnah. So the Gemara says, "Mi Amar Rabbi Yechon Hachi." Does Rabbi Yechon say even one Mishnah? Amar Rabbi Yechon halacha is tam Mishnah. The halacha is like an unauthored Mishnah. Tanami learned Rabbi Shalom de Chachma. His master that taught him wisdom. My Chachma. What does wisdom in the Mishnah mean? So the Gemara says, "Roiv Chachmasai." It means majority of his wisdom. Once again, yeah. So Rabbi Yechon rules that the teacher needs to teach you majority of the wisdom, and that's what when the Mishnah says wisdom, it means majority of the wisdom. Meaning the majority of one's wisdom was taught by this specific teacher. The rabbis taught somebody who studies the Torah scriptures. So it's good, but it's not complete because you need sort of a later book to be able to fill you in on the details. If you learn Mishnah, you learn Mishnayos. You're learning enough, and you also get rewarded. Gemara, if you're learning Talmud to understand the reasoning, there's nothing greater than studying Talmud. Okay, but there's a catch here, and the Gemara will try to explain in a moment. But you should always run to Mishnah. It's more than to Gemara. You're looking at me.
No,
Let's
just
continue.
interesting, yeah.
You just look at the next line of Gemara. Should explain what you're looking at.
Yeah.
Haguf Akasha, that doesn't make any sense. You're telling me the Gemara and L'chamid Gedel Mizu. We just said that Gemara is the greatest thing that exists. Right? And then what do you say? And then you're telling me that, well, Mishnayos is more important. You should learn Mishnayos more than Gemara. But which is it? So Rav Yechon says, we may Rebbe Nishnas Mishnazu. What happened was in the times of Rebbe, the Mishnah was, you can see Rashi for the full story. I'm sure ArtScroll has it in the footnote. We're now on top of the next page, 33b. It'll be the next page, probably the next.
Okay.
Probably the footnote on the next page. Basically, Rashi explains how it came to be, but basically, this was the first time during the period of Rebbe where people were able to study in peace and harmony, and the Mishnayos were all collected together. So, because of that, there was the collection of wisdom was there, and there was the ability to study in depth. So everybody stopped learning the Mishnayos, and then started to focus on the meaning of it. So therefore, they said. Hadadarshu. So then they explained, that don't ignore the body of wisdom as well, the body of knowledge, the body of collected information, which comprises the Mishnah. My Dorish, what's sort of the source for this? So the Gemara says, how do we know that really, in truth, Gemara is more important than Mishnayos? Like Rabbi Yehudah Bar Eloi taught. This is the verse states, Hagid la'ami psham ulebeis Yaakov chatosam. Tell my people their psham, their negligent sins. Ulebeis Yaakov, into the house of Yaakov, tell them chatosam, their inadvertent sins. Let's explain this. Hagid la'ami psham. Tell my nation their negligent sins. Elu tamid chacham. These are the scholars. Sheshgogos nasas lahem. Sheshgogos nasas lahem kizdainis. The inadvertent sin of a scholar is considered intentional. And the reason for this is because the inadvertent sin of a scholar here means a sin because of a misinterpretation of the law. So even though technically speaking, he thinks he didn't sin, but he's negligent because he didn't interpret the law correctly. So they're considered negligent. Well, Beis Yaakov Chatoisam tell the house of Yaakov about their inadvertent sins. Elo amei haaretz shezdoinis naslam kishagas. The common folk, their intentional sin is really unintentional because they don't necessarily know the laws. So we see here clearly that understanding the laws is critically important, because that is what allows you to understand what the law is. Right? It allows you to apply the law if you can only apply it if you understand it. Behind the Tanakh, and this we have a similar brisa. Rabbi Yehudah says, "Have a zor Talmud sheshigas Talmud oil zaden." Be very careful in studying Talmud, because the mistake in Talmud that results in a mistake in halacha is considered intentional. Dorish Rabbi Yehudah Rabbi Loi. Rabbi Yehudah Rabbi Loi taught, "Ma'idasiv shimu dvar Hashem acharedim al dvari." Here are the words of God. Those that are charedim al dvari, those that tremble for every word. Elu tamid chachamim. These are the scholars. Imru achechem. When you talk about their brothers, elu bali mikra. These are those that learn the verses. Seinechem, their enemies. Elu bali mishnah. So the Talmudical scholars tend to be enemies with the Mishnaic scholars, and the reason for this is because, again, one is focusing on the in-depth study, and one is focusing on the collection of knowledge. Okay, minadechem, those that were excommunicated. Elu ami aretz, these are the commoners. I'm not going to go through this at too much length, but at the time of the temple, especially according to Taisus, it was especially, or more specific, it was specifically because of the laws of Tumah and Tahara. Basically, because of the laws of ritual purity, there had to be a distance between the commoners and the laity and the scholarly, because basically the laity did not keep the laws of Tumah, and therefore, if the laity would even spit or accidentally, there would be a discharge from their mouth onto a scholar, the scholar would need to run to the mikveh. So the scholar would usually stand at a distance to the laity. So that wouldn't happen. You can imagine that creates a tremendous amount of animosity, and that's why they're referenced here as minadechem, excommunicated, because they really don't like each other. Shema Tomer pasuk sivim mevatel sichuyim. So you might think that there's sort of no hope for them. Talmud Leimer v'nira b'simchaschem. They will see in the salvation of God. Shema Tomer Yisrael yivoshu v'Talmud Leimer v'hem yivoshu avicham yivoshu Yisrael yismachu. The Jew at the end of time, the Jews will be very joyous, and the non-Jews, especially the ones that cause the Jewish people pain, will be destroyed. They'll be embarrassed.
The way we ended, was Mishnah greater than Talmud, or the study was?
Talmud is greater than Mishnah.
Talmud is greater.
The
than
exception to
Mishnah.
this is if you lived at the time of Rebbe and everybody was pursuing Talmud for the first time in a very, very long time.
Okay.
At that point, you say that you have to still have to have a nice amount of people learning Mishnayos. It's important to understand Mishnayos first.
Okay.
Okay. And that concludes the second parak. Third parak. Okay. This beginning, we should be able to move a little bit because we've seen this before. A guy gives his friend to watch behema, an animal like kalim or vessels. V'nignivu, they were stolen. Aisha avdu, they were lost. Okay, so what happens? Again, you have an unpaid watchman. He was negligent, or let's say he wasn't negligent. It was lost or stolen. Unpaid watchman. What's the rule? He makes an oath. But what happened? He didn't want to make an oath. He paid. Because he had the option of making an oath, and he decided not to. He decided instead of making an oath, he's paying. If they find the thief, who does he pay it to? If the guy paid instead of making an oath, he gets the benefit of the kefil and the dollar v'hei, double payment and the 4 and 5 payments. However, let's say nishbav l'rotz l'shalom. Let's say he made an oath and did not want to pay. Okay, let's say he made an oath to exempt himself. Then, when they find the thief and the thief pays either kefil or dollar v'hei, 4 and 5, he pays to the original owner, because the original owner is the one who suffered the loss. Okay. The first point is, why do we have to give two examples here? One of kefil, one of an animal. Why the two examples? It's necessary. The itana behema, because if the Mishnah would have just said behema, an animal, an animal has a lot of hassle, right? Anyone who has a pet knows that a pet is a hassle.
Oh, what?
It's a hassle.
It
takes a lot to take care of an animal.
Mhm.
So therefore, you'd think that a person would quicker give up the 4 and 5 animals because he doesn't want the hassle of dealing with an animal. He'd rather the cash. Especially not just one animal. If he gets back, he might even get back 4 and 5. There's a lot of, takes a lot of your time. So therefore, he's willing to give it up in return for payment. But vessels, they don't require, taking care of. They're not pets. They don't have to be taken care of. So maybe you shouldn't get it. You shouldn't have the original owner would rather not get the cash. He'd rather get the object when it's returned and get the kefil as well. So therefore, the Mishnah had to say that no, even by vessels you get kefil. The Itan Kalim would have just said vessels. I would think Kalim would demakni like Fela Mishnah Delay Nafish Keflayo. I would think that kefils, if the Mishnah would have just focused on vessels, I would say the reason why the watchman who pays gets the double payment for the vessels, gets 2 vessels, is because, well, it's just double, But maybe if an animal that was stolen, now you have to get 4 and 5 payments. That's a massive windfall, right? Quadruple your money. So maybe you shouldn't. Maybe the guy does not want to give you the double payments. He doesn't want to give you the payment of 4 and 5. So therefore, the Mishnah has to refer to both scenarios: scenario where you get more money, and a scenario where you get more of the item that you didn't want to have the hassle of. That you would not have had a hassle to deal with. Okay, now we get to the next question, the major question here. Here's the question: how is this working here? So the watchman pays for the stolen object, right? Therefore, he gets not only the object but the kefil. There's just a problem there. Who said there ever will be a kefil? It's true. Well, it was stolen, fine, but maybe the thief will admit that he stole it, and there's no kefil. Maybe, as a matter of fact, I'll never find the item, and there's no principle either. So, you cannot buy something that doesn't yet exist. For example, you can't buy the fruit of a tree before the tree is growing fruit. The afil or a mayor, and even according to a mayor that says that you could go in Paris decal. This is only true of the fruit of a tree. Because normally a tree will grow fruit. First of all, if it's lost, who said it was stolen? The intim salem or the migdava, even if it was stolen, who said you'll find the thief? The and even if you do find the thief, who says that the thief will pay? Dilma ma'idem iftar. Maybe he'll admit and he'll exempt himself. We're together. So how does a sale work? So here's the first opinion. Amarava nasika amarla shetigna v'tirtzev tashlemeni hare parasi knuyu lecha me'achshav. Okay, every time a person entrusts an item to be watched, it's as if he said, "Should it be stolen and you'll pay, then you get to keep it right now." So that's actually not a future tense. He didn't sell it to him in the future. He sold him at the time he entrusted him. He said, "If you're gonna pay me, if it's lost and you pay me, then it's yours from now." There's just one problem with this, because ihachi maskal roseri ihachi. I feel like he's a sev of the sanami. Alamatanya chutzim he's a sev of the sell. If that's the case, that you retroactively bought it at the moment the item was transferred, then what happens if you paid for it? You find the thief, and guess what? The animal gave birth. Who gets to keep the animal? Well, according to what we just explained, you actually bought it retroactively, so it should be the watchman who gets to keep the animal. But that's not the law. It's not the watchman that gets to keep the animal. It's the original owner that gets to keep it. Why is that? So Amar of Zera says, so, okay, basically, the idea is it's if the guy says as follows: every time I give something to a watchman, I make the following statement, even though I don't actually say it. It's as if I said the following: should the animal be stolen and you pay me for it, you get to keep the animal from now, but except with regard to the wool that's going to be the wool that will be shorn, or the animal that will be given birth, the fetus that was brought to term. My Pisco, why do you think the guy makes such an unusual addition to his unspoken claim? So the Gemara says, "Nah, this is normal. What's normal is that things that come on their own, meaning like wool that grows on its own, or an animal, a baby that grows on its own, calf, whatever it is, that's normal. So that a person keeps for himself. Things that aren't normal, like stolen and like stealing something in kefil, that's not included." The things that are natural, the person doesn't really sell. Ikeda Amri, one final teretz. Amarova nasik armla like shetigni v'teretz tashmeni tzamach like nivasik nilach. When it's stolen and you pay me for it, you get to keep it at the moment from the moment it was stolen. So it's not sold from the moment it was transferred to the watchman. It's stolen from the moment. It's sold from the moment before it was stolen. My benaya, what's the difference of opinion? Benaya kushid Rav Zera. The difference is the answer of the question of Rav Zera. Meaning, according to Rav Zera, according to the second opinion, it's sold a moment before stealing. You do have the fetus and the wool after it was stolen. You don't have it beforehand. Inami, another possibility is the Kamma be'agim. If when it was sold, it was standing in a it was stolen from a forest. So in that case, because it was sold a moment before it was stolen, and you can't acquire it in a forest, so therefore the guy doesn't actually get the kefil. Meaning the guy was watching the animal. It was stolen, but it was stolen from a forest, and he pays the money and doesn't make an oath. And then they find the thief. The thief gets to keep the kefil because the guy was unable to acquire it a moment before it was stolen. Okay.